Good evening and welcome to the 2020 Blueprint for Free Speech Whistleblowing Prizes. Now this year, because of the pandemic, we are celebrating the bravery, integrity and commitment to the public interest of whistleblowers remotely and virtually. And as you're going to hear this evening, their positive and enduring impact, as well as the challenges that they've had to go through, are very real. First of all, I'd like to welcome from Melbourne, Dr. Suelette Dreyfus. She is the Executive Director of Blueprint for Free Speech and was also on this year's judging panel.
Thank you, Razia, and good evening, everyone. As a member of the judging panel, I'm pleased to welcome you to the award event announcing the 2020 Blueprint Whistleblowing Prizes. Whistleblowing is about revealing serious wrongdoing or illegality in an organization or community that you are a part of. Whistleblowers might be an employee of a company, but equally they might be a volunteer board member of a soccer club or a school. Article 19 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights gives each of us the right to freedom of expression. In many ways, whistleblowing is an emerging human right and a specific kind of freedom of expression. It is the right to dissent from wrongdoing. We live in a time when truth is increasingly under threat. Whistleblowers are an antidote to the disease of lies and spin. They can't solve every problem, but they're a part of the solution. A vibrant media with an accurate and ethical but fearless journalists in it is also part of that solution. Whistleblowers and journalists together form a powerful corrective agent in our society. That's why we need to protect both and the channels that connect them. The pandemic has shown just how important whistleblowers are to warn us of imminent danger. Indeed, this pandemic began with whistleblowers in Wuhan, where doctors told their medical community of a strange new SARS-like virus they kept seeing. Health workers globally soon found themselves on two front lines: the health front line and the whistleblowing front line. They called out unsafe work practices, poor patient treatment, questionable supply chains, and incompetent decision-making by political leaders. Nurses sent into COVID patient wards, wrapped in garbage bags and reused masks, were putting themselves at risk. Staff who spoke out about preventable virus transmission in aged care facilities were sacked. Factory workers who insisted on wearing masks to work were bullied and eventually sacked. In fact, 20% of whistleblowers were dismissed for raising concerns about COVID-19 issues, according to a recent report by Protect. Gag clauses continue to be a problem for whistleblowers, and some of our 2020 prize winners illustrate just how bad that situation is. Fortunately, we have journalists. It's through them that we know the truth about the stories we'll be hearing about today. The total sum of money at the center of the cases that our Blueprint Prize winners have played a role is vast. More than £1 billion British pounds. The public interest and impact is high. Welcome to our award evening, recognizing these important whistleblowers who have contributed so much in the public interest.
Thank you very much, Suelette. We're now going to turn to Lady Sue Hollick, who is also on this year's judging panel. She's going to announce the winner of the International Blueprint for Free Speech Whistleblowing Prize.
Good evening, everyone. As a member of this year's judging panel, I'm delighted to announce that the winner of the 2020 Blueprint International Whistleblowing Prize is Bernard Collaery. Born near Reading, Bernard Collaery is a British-Australian barrister who's represented many clients from the military and intelligence services. He's a former Attorney General of the Australian Capital Territory, a regional government which includes Canberra, the capital city of Australia. His father, a World War II fighter pilot, was killed in action near The Hague. Bernard Collaery's story is an extraordinary one. It spans 5 countries, the birth of a new nation, and billions of dollars worth of oil and gas. It's a story of spies, international espionage, and corporate greed. The story begins with Timor-Leste's transition from Indonesia into an independent nation in 2002 and moves to Australia, the Netherlands, and Britain. Australia has a long history with Timor. In World War II, a group of Allied soldiers, including British, Australian, and Dutch, were trapped in the mountains in Timor, where they were disrupting the Japanese military presence. The Timorese hid and protected them at a terrible cost to themselves. Timor is one of the poorest countries in Asia. 27% of the population suffers from food deprivation. It only has one natural asset: oil and gas fields. These are under the sea that divides Australia and Timor. The two allies must share the revenue. The Australian government sent spies to electronically bug the offices of the fledgling nation's president and cabinet to gain unfair advantage in the treaty being negotiated. One of the richest countries in the Asia-Pacific spied on and betrayed one of the poorest. When Timor discovered the treachery, it went to the International Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. It wanted the treaty set aside because Australia had acted in bad faith. Witness K, a courageous Australian intelligence officer, was due to give evidence before the court. On the eve of the first day of the hearing, the Australian police raided his home, took his passport, and raided the home and barrister's chambers of his lawyer, Bernard Collaery. Bernard was already in The Hague. Since then, the Australian government has relentlessly pursued Witness K and Bernard Collaery. It has spent more than £1 million trying to prosecute Bernard. He's been through 9 months of hearings and 7 judgments. He risks being sent to prison. But Bernard has refused to go quietly. He's spoken out to the media and in public. Today, the tiny nation of Timor-Leste has finally achieved a better outcome. Australia has been forced to renegotiate the terms of the treaty to give it a fairer proportion of the oil and gas revenues to Timor. Whistleblowing was instrumental in achieving this. However, those who have told the truth about the case are still in a dangerous situation due to the retaliation for whistleblowing. Bernard's story highlights that those under threat no longer include only whistleblowers and journalists who work with them in the public interest. Increasingly, whistleblowers' lawyers are now being targeted. Good lawyers often support a whistleblower in many ways, psychologically, practically, and strategically, as well as giving legal advice. Blueprint has previously recognised Witness K in its prizes. This year, we are proud to recognise Bernard Collaery.
Thank you, Sue, and warm congratulations to Bernard Collaery. Very well deserved. Jon Snow interviewed Bernard Collaery via Zoom from his home in Canberra a few days ago. We'll see the kinds of pressures that he has been under now.
When did you come into this picture?
Well, strangely, John, when I was a young man, 22, I was trained by one of the Australians who had participated in the war against Japan. He was a former commando, and he told us, then trainees, about the support the East Timorese and their Portuguese priests, of course, had given the embattled Australians. The Australians were isolated, surrounded, retreated into the mountains and conducted a guerrilla war. The Timorese suffered large reprisals And it's a fantastic story of bravery, courage, and a bond that developed from the war between Australia and the East Timorese, which makes the rest of the story so awful.
So Bernard, can you sort of encapsulate what happened next? What brought you into this story of, well, exploitation of the grimmest nature?
I had a soft place for the East Timorese because of my training and what I'd heard of the Second World War, and I became an advisor to the East Timorese resistance during its occupation years, a legal advisor assisting them on international law issues as they sought to gain their independence. The years moved on, and eventually Timor gained its independence in a ballot supervised by the United Nations. After that occurred, Australia effectively commenced a process of betraying its wartime ally. And that betrayal, motivated by petroleum revenue issues, led, of course, to the treachery that has seen me at the moment facing trial in my own court.
When you got involved with the East Timorese sort of liberation people, had you been Attorney General in Canberra at that point?
Yes, I had years of assistance to them from the early 80s. When I became Attorney General, I had, of course, parliamentary privilege, and I was able to assist in revealing and ventilating the unholy alliance between Australia and Indonesia with respect to the exploitation of the petroleum resources in the Timor Sea close to East Timor.
Where did things begin to go wrong, as it were?
Things began to go wrong when we started to have a bite on the Australians, when the treachery that was underway was revealed, when Australia decided to depart essentially from international norms and the rule of law to undertake misconduct with respect to negotiating a revenue treaty. It's misconduct that under Australia's, ironically, anti-terrorist laws, I'm not allowed to give you details of. You're free, John, to speak of it, others are. I can't speak about what I've now been put to my trial for. I commenced 2 years of very close, detailed research to deal with information. Negotiations started with Australia from the East Timorese perspective for Australia to, as it were, cancel the treaty that had been achieved by way of that fraudulent conduct, and for there to be a fair negotiation between the two countries.
What I'm now beginning to see, Bernard, is that you, a lawyer of some standing, had become a very serious thorn in the Australian government's flesh. You were heading for trouble.
Well, indeed, and there was a very senior, as it were, alleged whistleblower in that picture, John, and I was acting as lawyer for that person, the approved lawyer for that person, not the first such person I've represented.
Am I allowed to say that he worked in intelligence?
I'm not allowed to comment on that in any way, John, but there has been ample public comment in that regard. He's popularly seen as a whistleblower, but the fact of the matter is that he brought his information forward by an approved process, as much as you could say that was a whistleblowing process, through me, and I had approval to take any necessary action that witness K chose before any court or tribunal. I don't think the Australian Inspector General, in giving that authority, foresaw that tribunal might be an international tribunal, might be at The Hague.
This is just absolutely unbelievable, because I mean, although obviously it was a very big story in Australia, it was not widely known right across the world, as it were. And yet, in a sense, it was a symbolic fight that represented much of the worst of what happened in the process of decolonisation. So it was an incredibly important case. But you're walking into an extremely delicate situation, or you're already in a very delicate situation, in that all this is shrouded in official secrets. And for you to fight the case, you're going to have to blow a whistle. Did you?
Well, yes. And that triggered an unprecedented event in Australian legal history. Whilst I was working in Cambridge with some of Britain's most eminent international lawyers, the Australians were planning a raid on my chambers here in Australia, which indeed they carried out within 24 hours of me leaving Australia to present the beginnings of our case at The Hague. I was asleep in my bed when there was a bang on my door in The Hague, and I was told that the Australian intelligence officials and the police had been in my chambers throughout the preceding day, holding my clerk there incommunicado, insisting that she not go to the bathroom with the door shut. It was a most shameful episode in Australian history, which of course the International Court subsequently condemned.
Well, now here is the Australian government up to its neck now in an extremely sordid attempt to clamp down on you and all the stuff that you had in your back pocket in terms of information about what had been going on. And I'm just wondering, was this a huge live story in Australia, or was it all going on behind the curtains?
It was a huge live story. I mean, the matter was public before I knew about it. It was a most public raid on my chambers, home, and on the home of witness K, whose passport was seized, just to ensure that by chance he might be giving evidence in The Hague, he would not be able to get to The Hague. That itself was a complete contempt of the processes of international law.
My sense of a whistleblower is a one-off, big noise, bang, done. But this seems to have been a kind of event that went on for year after year.
It produced a wave of revulsion in the Australian legal community to start with. It then motivated the Australian community at large. There were massive protests, and there continue to be, because it's seen as a betrayal of the Australian fair go concept. This was the most impoverished country of Asia and the richest, wealthy country in the region, conducting this kind of treaty fraud on a population that was losing at that time, I believe, 1 in 7 of its infants before the age of 5.
If you had not blown the whistle, would the government ever have reached this equitable agreement over East Timor?
Not at all.
But they admitted their guilt, in a sense, by doing the deal that needed to be done in all justice, but then persecuted and prosecuted the very man who'd brought it about.
Yes, it's a great shame. I can speak up, but witness K, for obvious reasons, cannot reveal his identity. Clearly, this has intimidated and will intimidate my profession. They think, they believe, they won't, because the entire Australian Law Council has come out against secret trials. But the question is, will it intimidate the loyal, decent, ethical members of our Secret Service? That's the big question. And if Australia engages in such dirty dealing as that, don't we have concern about the throttling of information now as a result of this prosecution?
How many years to see you on the stand, as it were?
Well, 18 months, 2 years have elapsed. There have been 42 preliminary appearances. The Australian government is insisting that the matter that is the gravamen, the core of the issue, the unmentionable issue, the neither confirm nor deny issue, can only be heard in secret.
People are going to be absolutely astounded that anybody in Australia is prepared to tolerate this. I mean, your own profession pours scorn on it. Those people in the know, in the political classes, I imagine, are also pretty dubious about the whole business. Why is it still continuing? Why don't they call an end to it? It's more embarrassing for the government and absolute torture for you and witness K.
Well, there is some other motive, and it probably is to intimidate anyone else who might come forward. There's witness K. Is there a witness LMNOPQ? What has gone on? I mean, we don't know that.
Of course, you are of a standing at a level of many of the people who are going to have to sit in judgment over you, the judges. Are they really going to hear this case ever? And can they really find for the government?
Well, it's like a bad dream, John. I've spent my career in the Supreme Court here in Canberra, Australia's national capital. I'll be in the dock that I've spent my career facing, defending people. There's some Shakespearean tragedy evolving, probably, but it's inconceivable, but it's happening. And it's happening in Australia, and it's happening at a time when there's a widespread revulsion in terms of many other issues about rule of law in our nation. There's a widespread call for an anti-corruption body to be established to deal with issues in the Australian Federal Parliament. So there's a broader issue about this whistleblowing. There's a deadly urgency about the need for a corruption body and a return to rule of law in Australia. This is a very serious situation. When I see, for example, a former Director of Public Prosecutions of the stature of Keir Starmer on my BBC and other news, I see that the British public understand the rule of law. The Australian public are understanding that there is a serious departure from the rule of law in Australia at the moment.
Bernard Collaery, you are a true and worthy winner of the Blueprint Prize in a most deserving, hugely deserving, unprecedentedly deserving way. It's an honour to have talked to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much to John. I'm now going to hand over to James Catlin, another one of this year's judges, who is going to announce the UK winner of the 2020 Blueprint for Free Speech Whistleblowing Prize.
Thank you, Razia. Good evening, everyone. My name's James Catlin. I'm a member of the jury panel. It's my pleasure to announce the winner of this year's Blueprint UK Whistleblowing Prize, Sally Masterton. Sally is an accountant and insolvency practitioner based in Scotland, and she worked for the Halifax Bank of Scotland before it was acquired by Lloyds and then continued on there. What is important in many whistleblowing cases is not only admitting the original wrongdoing or crime disclosed, it's whether the top executives address the problem. Sally Masterton discovered the serious wrongdoing and raised concerns with the bank. In 2014, Sally produced the Project Lord Turnbull report, an internal Lloyds document, and in it she warned the senior bank executives had received information about the fraud and the money laundering, but had failed to act on it. Lloyds spent years denying publicly that anything had happened, until in 2017 6 executives were convicted and sentenced to a total of 47 years imprisonment. A second aspect of whistleblowing cases in the financial sector is whether the regulator acts on the wrongdoing. The Financial Times reported in 2017, and I quote, "In this case, over a 6-year period, the regulatory authorities have been shown to be supine to the point of allowing the bank to act as its own judge and jury in a case involving financial fraud and money laundering. No senior executives of Lloyds have been investigated," the Financial Times then said. Finally, due perhaps to the mounting pressure Britain's financial watchdog, the Financial Conduct Authority, fined Lloyds Banking Group £45.5 million for failure to disclose suspicion of fraud. Lloyds has commissioned a High Court judge, Dame Linda Dodds, to review the bank's response to the case. The Dobbs report is now due in 2021. What we know is that this case highlights the importance of whistleblowing in the financial sector. Proper protections for whistleblowers that work in practice, not just on paper, help to ensure the integrity of that sector. It is doubly so as financial markets become ever more complex and difficult for regulators to investigate. Many whistleblowers are forced into silence by their employers even after the whistleblower has left the company. They are gagged from telling the truth in public. Sally Masterton is unable to be with us here today due to legal constraints. Nonetheless, we celebrate her contributions to greater honesty and integrity in the financial sector. I'd now like to introduce Jonathan Ford, the city editor of the Financial Times newspaper in London. Jonathan's a seasoned financial journalist with more than a decade of experience at the newspaper, and he has written extensively on the HBOS Lloyds case. He'll be speaking with Razia in London. Welcome, Jonathan, and congratulations, Sally Masterton, winner of the 2020 Blueprint UK Whistleblowing Prize.
Congratulations to Sally Masterton. We are sorry that for legal reasons, Sally is not able to receive her prize in person. I've been speaking to Jonathan Ford, though, of the FT. He's been following this case very closely, and he explained to me why it's important and the impact that it's had on Sally herself.
Jonathan, just outline how significant this case is. You know, we're talking about an alleged financial crime on a pretty huge scale. We're talking about data being shredded, cover up in a major bank, a senior police officer describing this as one of the largest bank frauds ever.
Well, it is a fairly extraordinary story. The size of the fraud isn't really known, partly because we just don't know enough about what went on inside. Originally, the bank involved was HBOS, which was a bank that failed in the financial crisis and was taken over by Lloyds. The absolute details of how much money was lost are still pretty much unclear, but it's fairly clear it was pretty large. It was, I think, internal bank documents suggest that it could be as big as $1 billion or more.
Let's go back, though, and just look at those small businesses that were the victims of this fraud. Explain what happened.
Okay. So HBOS was a bank that was created around the millennium when the Bank of Scotland merged with Halifax. It had a strategy which was to grow its business banking unit. And it took on lots and lots of corporate customers across the UK. The ones that we're concerned with here involved a business or a branch in Reading, which was a specific unit in HBOS, which was responsible for what they called higher risk customers. So these were not necessarily businesses in financial difficulties, although some of them might have been. They were small companies which needed extra assistance. The idea was that the bank was helping them to grow and to avoid getting into trouble. And this unit in Reading was run by a man who was corrupt, and he became involved with a group of fraudsters who ran a business called Quayside, which was responsible for advising small companies. And what they conceived was this rather cunning scheme where HBOS and the manager in charge would find a company which had, let's say, lots of assets but not a huge amount of capital. And he would say to them, we're going to put you into the high-risk unit. And as you're now in the high-risk unit, we need to review your business. So we want you to appoint this business, Quayside, to advise you. And that's going to be a condition of us continuing to lend to you. And these small companies would then literally put these people often on the board of the company. So the fraudsters would actually be directors of the businesses, and they would then make large loans to these companies, which would get looted. They would force the owners of the businesses to sell assets to them at an undervaluation, and essentially they stripped them of their wealth and their assets. And remember that these were businesses built up by, family businesses built up by people maybe over 20, 30 years, which were destroyed. When HBOS started to get into financial difficulty around the time of the financial crisis, of course, they started to investigate, what's going on, why have we got these big losses here and there? And they broadly uncovered it in 2007. And we've seen emails, I've seen emails dating from that time, and it's a time when HBOS was trying to raise capital, so it was trying to complete its accounts so it could put a prospectus to the stock exchange to raise some money. And these emails between people say, oh, what about this fraud? What should we do? And they're worried about the numbers being too large so that they'll have to be disclosed in a prospectus. So this was all known about a long time ago. But then mysteriously, Lloyds took over HBOS during the financial crisis when it failed. And Lloyds didn't recognise that there was a fraud at all. Indeed, its position when it took over HBOS was there'd never been a fraud. So all the customers who had been cheated, and some of them were living in utter penury at this point, and were being pursued by the bank for their homes, because often they'd given personal guarantees to the bank, despite having been cheated, were in a position where they couldn't persuade Lloyds to even imagine that a fraud could have taken place.
So as an employee of Lloyds, Sally Masterton comes across documentation that reveals that Lloyds are not telling the whole story or even a partial story.
How did she become aware of the information? Well, the reason why was because her job had been essentially almost like an internal bank investigator. So when the bank had a problem and they needed to find out what had been going on, was a customer straight, was the bank doing the right thing, she was the sort of forensic accountant they would turn to. So, and she had access, of course, to all the historic records of HBOS because, that's what she did. And when she sort of, and the thing which triggered her original interest in the case, because there's no particular reason why she would have picked it up, was a colleague in Lloyds phoned her up in 2011 and said, there's been a DTI investigation into this whole business, referring to Reading, and we need to shred some documents, which of course made her think, what the hell is going on? So she started to look more closely into what was known in the documents about these cases. And as she looked at it, she realized that the bank's position, as she saw it, was a very bad one. There was lots of information which suggested that customers were not being treated fairly, and that the knowledge of what had gone on and that what it constituted, that it really was a fraud, was all there.
We're speaking to you because you know a lot about this case, but also we can't speak to Sally for legal reasons. In that context, how common is it that whistleblowers are prevented, stymied from speaking out in these sorts of cases, particularly in the financial sector?
Well, I think, let's think for a second about the financial sector. The one thing about it which is clear is that it's well paid. And I think if you lose a job, if you're reasonably senior in a financial services job and you lose it, the likelihood of replacing it with a job of a similar income is not easy. People build up a lifestyle and they're very loath to lose their lifestyle. I think that in this sector, one of the issues, I think, is that if you stand up and make a fuss, effectively, for all the promises that you will be taken seriously, all the rest of it, in effect, I think it's almost inevitable that you will fall out with the people who you report to, because you are essentially creating a problem for them in their eyes, a problem which could, if it's a big problem like this one, could be really dramatically problematic. And people are frightened. And when people are frightened, they get quite angry. There's a tendency, therefore, to look for a way in which the bank can, or a financial firm, let's keep it general, a financial firm can kind of throw the bone, if you like, the problem to an external kind of supposedly neutral figure. But that's often essentially a law firm which is hired by the bank to adjudicate what's going on. And I think it's very difficult for a law firm to be brought in those circumstances to find in favour of the whistleblower. Because if you think the whole thing is set up, that it's so obvious, do you want to be helpful or not, I think. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of any particular cases, but I do think there's a cultural sort of thing which is that effectively everyone is working fairly quickly towards the same thing, which is they say, let's just basically, okay, we've got a problem, there's a great pile on the carpet, let's find a way of sweeping it up, let's get rid of this person who's made the problematic allegations, and first of all, we'll sort of slightly scare them by pushing them into a corner, and then we'll come in and we'll offer them a way out. We'll say, look, it's fine, we'll pay you quite a lot of money, and we accept that you're probably not going to work in the industry again, because you almost certainly won't. And so there you go. And that's sort of what happens all the time. Now, the problem with that, of course, is, and it's a problem with your journalists working who looks at these cases, is that you realise that the person who doesn't ever get a look in, or the thing that never gets a look in, is the truth and justice. It's a system which, within its own narrow sphere, works pretty efficiently. But it means that it's much harder to believe that really lessons are ever learned, because essentially there's a mechanism pretty quickly that's sort of vacuuming up the problem and making it go away.
And in the context of a possible future picture in the financial world, I mean, if there was a reform that you would like to see that would protect whistleblowers, if you like, and also take care of the public interest in all of this, what would that be? What would you look for?
Well, I think one of the things I think it's a very problematic area, but I think one of the things is to take away the power of the institution which is being whistleblown about to, if you like, dangle a check over the individual in return for their silence. So, and I know that everyone will say, well, of course, it doesn't stop you talking to the regulator, doing this or that, but it does stop you making public what you know. And that, to my mind, is often the best, if you like, sort of disinfectant in these cases, is knowing that somebody has a forum to speak, as Sally Khan, publicly about her experience. I think it would be healthy, therefore, if you had a system where it was possible for there to be some way in which whistleblowers could be financially provided for in serious cases, in ways that didn't involve them having to go on bended knee to their ex-employer. But I do think the idea that there should be some sort of financial, almost like a sort of a pension system for people who do come forward and secure some, or bring a piece of important information into the public domain, so that they are not beholden to the people who they used to work for.
Is there a sense that those people who hold the power are the big corporations, the big banks, and that they will always be protected because of that?
What shows it to be a poor system is when you come up close to the people who are affected by these decisions and and realize how unbelievably sort of Kafkaesque it can be to be caught up in the middle of something where it's fairly clear to you. I mean, first of all, your life's been ruined. Second, it's fairly clear to you that it wasn't ruined because you messed it up. And yet, all the forces of kind of the powerful forces who could help you are all telling you it's your fault. I think that's, and once you sort of see that, you see how it's hard to think that that's such a bad state of affairs, that more should be done to prevent that from being the case in future.
Jonathan Ford, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Razia, and special guests, journalists John Snow and Jonathan Ford. This event, announcing and celebrating the recipients of the Blueprint Whistleblowing Prizes, illustrates the contribution that whistleblowers make in achieving justice. Our prize winners this year have had incredible impacts. Between them and those who've worked with them and supported them, they have helped to right some monumental wrongs. They have done this with information, facts, evidence, but in the age of information, data alone is not enough. We really need voices too. Our prize winners are two of those voices, and the experience of speaking out has not been easy for them. Sally Masterton discovered criminals posing in everyday life as bankers and corporate service providers. They were tricking innocent people out of their homes and life savings. She turned to her employer to stop the wrongdoing. You would have hoped that she was thanked for her diligence. This was not the case. This often happens with whistleblowers. If you'd like to know more about that, Bernard Collaery's new book has just been published. It's called Oil Under Troubled Waters. A handful of people and those who supported them have made a profound change to the ledger of justice in our societies. Whistleblowers have been at the center of that change. We can't do without them. Tonight we recognize Sally Masterton and Bernard Collaery in their courageous refusal to be intimidated or cowed, and that's something we're celebrating. Congratulations to the winners of the 2020 Blueprint Whistleblowing Prizes. Thank you.
Thank you, Suelette, and my thanks to Jonathan Ford for speaking to me. And of course, warm congratulations to both winners. I think we've been given a real insight into both the courage and the commitment these people have in the pursuit of truth and transparency. A real inspiration to us. Thanks so much for being with us this evening. Enjoy the rest of your day.